Hello, my name is JD Kamas. I'm the Director of Programming and Education at the First Division Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to Cantini Park, the historic estate of Colonel Robert R. McCormick. He was the owner and editor of the Chicago Tribune, and he had also served in the 1st Infantry Division. And in his will, he put that he would like the history of the division preserved and told to the public. So what we have tonight is our head curator, Bill Brewster, is going to tell you about how we actually go about doing that. So please welcome Bill Brewster.
Am I on? Yeah. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming. And you see the tower to talk is how and why we collect. So we're going to flip that right away. It really should be why and how. The why part is pretty straightforward, honestly, and JD covered it, all right? That's the why. All right, Robert R. McCormick served with the 1st Division in World War I, 5th Artillery, at the Battle of Cantini. That's why our park is named Cantini. His estate was named Cantini. He celebrated and honored the soldiers of the 1st Division, later the 1st Infantry Division, as we know it now, and brought the veterans here, established a Legion post. And when he died in '55, he left his estate and his monies to support educational purposes and also to provide for the continuing history of the 1st Infantry Division and the teaching of that history. And that's what we're responsible for, is teaching that history. Teaching the history of the soldiers of the 1st Division who served in World War I, the soldiers who served in World War II, those veterans, the 1st Division men who served in Vietnam, and the soldiers in the current conflicts through the Gulf War. And of course, all the soldiers who served in the 1st Division in peacetime also. We cover all of that. And that's all because of Robert R. McCormick. And so our basic mission, and this is what's key to a museum and a museum's collection, is having a mission that's simple and straightforward. All right? The simpler your mission is, the easier it is to collect, as long as you pay attention to what you're doing. Right? So our mission is to preserve, interpret, and present the history of the United States Army's 1st Infantry Division. It's pretty straightforward, right? Well, now we get to the difficult part, which is the how. You would think, well, Bill just laid it out. How can't be so hard? But how is a real challenge? How is unique to any particular curator or curatorial staff? How they go about maintaining, deciding what to bring in, what not to accept, what to leave out. And so the only way that you can really learn about our how, which is my how, is to learn about me. And so we're going to go back to the beginning. Oh, wait. Okay, well, we're not going to go that far back. All right, that's a little too far back. But we are going to go back here. All right. Is that not a cute kid? All right. In 1966, Bill Brewster liked to dress up in costumes. All right, I enjoyed a good costume as much as any kid did. And I grew up with these 3 people, all right? From right to left, it's my grandmother, Frida Melby Brewster, her brother, Ralph Melby, and then her sister, and the most important person for my development, early development in this picture, is the woman on the left, which is, excuse me, did I say Frida earlier? Eva is on the right. This is Frida Melby on the far left. All right, that's my great aunt. And my great aunt ran an antique store out of the basement of the house that she shared with my grandmother. And so that little kid in the cowboy get-up would go to this house when he was 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, and he'd make his way down into that antique store. People don't have antique stores in their basements anymore, do they? But apparently it was a thing in the 1950s and 60s, because we used to go around and visit other people with antique stores in their basements, right? But that antique store was all filled with glassware. So I learned something very early on as a little kid. Don't touch. Don't touch, right? And walk. And it was all little narrow aisles, so I learned to walk like this. And I had nothing else to do for days on end at my grandmother and my great aunt's house other than walk around these little aisles and look at all this glassware and think, well, where's the guns? Where are the uniforms? Because, you know, we got Life magazine at home. We got National Geographic at home. We're at the end of the Civil War centennial, right? So Civil War centennial was in magazines. Vietnam War was in magazines as a kid. And so that's the type of material I was interested in. And then one day, I found a room in the basement, right? It wasn't a room full of glassware. It was the coal bunker, right? Limestone basement, little room off to the side. Opened it up, pulled the light cord, and there was a stack of foot lockers. Foot lockers that belonged to this guy right, in the middle there. This guy, that's my grandfather, Francis Thoburn Brewster. Yeah. So he was a captain in the 4th Infantry Division in World War I. Now he went on, he did many things, and again, we don't go through the entire history, but he later enlisted in World War II, re-enlisted in World War II, served until 1947, and it was in the California National Guard on the Mexican border prior to World War I. So his footlocker, and he had passed before I was born, but his footlockers were all in this little side room. Well, dangerously, I climbed up to the stack and opened them up and started going through them. And my grandmother and aunt found me and said, you know, no, this isn't something that you really need to play with. You need to stay out of this material. But at the age of about 8, I was hooked on this type of material because it was much more interesting to me than the glassware. All right, the teacups are fascinating, but the stuff that was in these foot lockers was really interesting to me. And actually, one of the pieces that came out, the first piece that came out of one of those foot lockers was this piece. All right? Well, now I got to put my silly glove on. Laura, would you take that around? This is a Porringer, right, for feeding babies. It came from a woman in France who befriended my grandfather during the occupation following World War I. And you can see she engraved it as a souvenir from France to Francis Brewster. I think she gave that to me on my 10th birthday. And again, I was hooked. I was drawn deeper in. That's not really breakable, okay? That's not like all the glassware that was spread throughout the rest of the basement. So that was a piece that hooked me. And then through the years, more was given to me, right? And I got pieces here and there. But I was intrigued and I was pulled in by that material culture. And why I thought that material culture, and that's a term that we're going to use tonight, is material culture. Is everybody familiar with that term, material culture? That's what we do, all right? That's what I do. I work with material culture. Material culture is objects. It's the objects that we use every day. So everything in this room right now is part of material culture, right? Might not belong in a museum right now, but potentially could belong in a museum. So we're always working with material culture. And the material culture that I ended up dealing with and work with to this day is the three-dimensional materials, right? So anything that's three-dimensional, material culture comes to me, right? Not the paper. It's not that I'm not interested in it. Well, that's not true. Toilet paper comes to me. But all the other paper goes to the archives, right? Because it's got information on it. So that's the division there. But that material culture, which wasn't a term I was throwing around as a 10-year-old, I can guarantee you. But that material is what I was interested in. And so, when I hit 14 years of age, when I was getting ready to go into high school, my parents said, well, you got to get a job in the summers. You got to do something. But you can volunteer somewhere. If you want to, you can volunteer. And I said, well, I'd love to volunteer, and I know exactly where I'm going to volunteer. There's a Civil War museum in the state capitol in Madison, Wisconsin. That's where I grew up, is Madison, Wisconsin, all right? So the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic Memorial Hall was in the state capitol. It was a Civil War museum, a small one. So I went up there as a 14-year-old and I volunteered. And I said, I would love to work here. And in 1974, apparently there weren't a lot of kids going to the Grand Army of the Republic Memorial Hall in the state capitol and saying, I'd like to work here. And so they said, sure, you can work here. And they put me to work numbering objects, cataloging objects, working at the desk, doing whatever it was to fill in and help out. So I worked there for 2 years, all right? 2 summers I worked there, but I outgrew the Grand Army of the Republic Memorial Hall. So I thought, well, where else can I work in Madison as a high school kid? So the next place I went was the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. It's a pretty good institution. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Well, it's a pretty good institution, especially from an archive side, but also from a museum collection side. So I went there. Their collections are all stored under that building, all right? The entire basement, the length of that structure, is all storage of objects. And I walked in there and I made the same pitch. And I said, hey, I've been working for 2 years in the Grand Army of the Republic Hall. I would love to work at this institution. And they said, well, we don't have very many people volunteering here. 1977. It's not something that anyone really, kids don't come up here. We don't have college students volunteering. Sure, come on in. So I worked for 2 years, 2 summers in that facility with that collection, which was, again, significantly larger, but it gave me a greater appreciation of material culture and the potential for objects. And I went from a museum that was exclusively military and exclusively Civil War to a museum that covered Wisconsin history writ large, all of Wisconsin history, to include the military aspects of it. So there was a fair amount of glassware there too, which I still didn't touch. I walked around very gingerly and avoided. But I got out of high school and I went on and I decided to go to college. But what I also decided was, you know, I've worked at 2 museums while I was in high school. It can't possibly be a career path for anybody. All right? There's no way that you're going to work in a museum as a profession. So I decided to get a degree in social services. But I didn't lose my interest in history. So during the summers when I was getting my degree in social services, I worked for the National Park Service, Petersburg, Virginia, as a costumed interpreter. Can you see me in that picture, right? That's me right there, right? Yeah. So let's see. It's been 13 years, and I went from dressing up like a cowboy to dressing up like a Civil War soldier. Right? Same hat. I don't think, you know, my head must not have grown. It didn't get much bigger. But working with the public and talking to the people about history held a great fascination for me. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed talking to people, instructing them and saying, this is what a soldier's life was like, and talking about a soldier's life. So 4 years in the Park Service, working at Petersburg National Battlefield Park. If you've ever been there, a little south of Richmond, Virginia. Great park, fascinating place. Still love to go there, but it's really hot in the summers. It's really hot when you're wearing a wool uniform there. But you know, I finished this degree in social services, and I thought, oh, is this really what I want to do? No, it really wasn't what I wanted to do. I think that's the wrong slide. Well, my slides are out of order. I missed one. That's my fault. So what I did was I went to work for Madison Newspapers. Okay, because social services wasn't cutting it. I still didn't think you could get a job in museums. So I decided to get a job in a newspaper driving a fork truck, which is a terrific job. I love driving fork trucks. I mean, they're fun, it's exciting, it's interesting. But what I noticed in the newspaper is I drove out to the warehouse, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, out to the warehouse with pallet loads of papers. was there a stack of pallets off to the side in the warehouse that had something that was different. It wasn't anything we ever dealt with at the newspaper. I didn't know what it was, so one day on a break, I walked down in there, and I looked, and I thought, well, what's on all these pallets? Of course, it was none of my business, but I'm a nosy kid. And I looked, and it was full of bound newspapers. All right, now, the newspaper, Madison Newspapers, is the Wisconsin State Journal and the Capital Times. Those are the two primary newspapers in Madison. The Wisconsin State Journal is the paper of record for the state of Wisconsin. It's been around since the 1850s. These were the bound volumes of all the newspapers, all right, going back to the founding of the company, the 1850s, and they were bound by quarters, all right? So every newspaper for every quarter starting in the 1850s all the way up to, I guess they weren't still binding them by the time I was there, but probably up until the early 1970s, were all bound and stacked up on these pallets. And I thought, well, this is terrible. What are they doing with these newspapers? Why do they have these out here? Why does the fork truck driver care? I cared. I was very concerned about them. I thought, well, you know, they're getting covered with the dust and the soot from the propane, from the fork trucks. They're going to be ruined. This is a terrible thing to be doing with these newspapers. So I went and sat with my supervisor, and I worked the third shift, okay? So I worked from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., whatever it was. I went to my supervisor, and I said, you know, all these old newspapers are on these pallets out in the warehouse. And she said, really? I said, yeah. I said, you know, they're getting ruined. They're sitting out there in their historic newspapers. I don't think that that's really the best conditions for them. And she said, really? I said, no, I don't. And she said, well, what do you think we ought to do about it? I said, well, I think that we ought to cover them somehow. She said, that's a really great idea. Now, again, I'm throwing out places. Has anybody ever been in a mailroom in a newspaper? Everyone raise their hands. Yes, of course you have. All right, you do all kinds of things. You process the newspapers out there. You put inserts into the newspapers. And you have to send bundles of newspapers out when it's raining, right? And so you have machines that will plastic wrap the bundles of newspapers. They go down a line. There's a plastic machine. It seals them. It wraps them. And you send them out to the distributors and the carriers, and they get their newspapers. I said, you know what? I bet we could set up one of our plastic wrap lines to wrap up all of those books individually. And she said, well, that's a really great idea. I said, yeah, I think it's a really great idea. So we took a line in the newspaper because we had a side line, and we laid it out with the conveyor belts, and we had one of the plastic wrap machines. And newspapers, the presses, they break down, right? Different things happen. You have to change a plate. Some story happens. A roll of paper, the reel breaks, something happens, and sometimes you're down for a significant amount of time. So we had this deal worked out. I said, well, every time we go down, it looks like we're going down for a amount of time, I'm going to bring up one of these pallets of historic newspapers, and then we'll start wrapping them. She said, that's a great idea. We ought to do that. And we did that for about 2.5 weeks. And then the mailroom supervisor, who of course worked the day shift, decided to come in an hour early one day. And he walked in, and the presses were all down, and we're all off merrily running this sideline. And he walks in, and I remember I was over at the sideline, and we were running it, and I turned around, and I saw him coming, and I saw him looking at us. Then I saw him looking around for the supervisor of the third shift, and I saw him spot her, and I saw her look at me, and then he went like this, and she went into his office, and she came back out and says, no, we can't wrap those newspapers anymore like that. That's not something that they think is a good idea. So they took all those newspapers, though, and they thought, well, what are we going to do with them? They took them, and they held a contest, all right? And it was a statewide contest, and whoever could write the best story submission to the newspaper to justify getting any particular volume, one of these quarterly volumes for the entire history newspaper, would be allowed to take it. And so they gave away all of those newspapers to whoever wanted to get them, and it was a great promotional effort for the newspaper, and they all said, oh, look at that fork truck driver had a really great idea. He showed us all these newspapers. Isn't that tremendous? So I still had that interest in history. But I decided, you know what? This has sparked me. I need to do something else. I I need to get a degree in horology. That was my next decision. All right, I want to be a horologist. Everyone knows what that is, right? Horologist, right? Right? I was a watch and clock maker. That's what I decided was the next best thing for me to do, was become a watch and clock maker. So I went to school, and I became a watch and clock repairman. And the man who was running that course, because there was only one instructor, and you went, and he said, why do you want to become a watch and clock maker? And everybody was like, well, my dad's a watch and clock maker, my dad's a watch and clock maker, my dad's a watch. And he gets to me, and I said, well, I want to live in Virginia. And, you know, I couldn't really see my way to a job in the National Park Service. I couldn't figure that out. I don't think there's really jobs doing what I want to do. So I think if I can become a watch and clock maker, I'll be able to get a job in Virginia, because it seems like a field where you can get a job. I was behind the curve as far as watch technology at that point. I thought, well, this is fascinating. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll get you a job in Virginia if you pass this course, because I have a very good friend in Richmond who runs these programs. It runs a chain of jewelry stores in Richmond. I passed the program, I went to Richmond, I got the job. It was perfect. It was everything that I could have asked for. But it still wasn't enough. Obviously, I did not want to be a watch and clock repairman. Right? As much as it's fascinating. It's a very interesting field. But it isn't what I wanted to do. And so when I was in Richmond, I started going to school again. And it finally dawned on me that I need to get a job working in a museum. And a friend of mine was on the phone with me from Missouri, and he said, you know what? There's a program here at my university in museum studies and in historic house preservation. And I thought, well, that's what I want to do. I want to do historic house preservation. So I packed up, took my fiance, and we moved to Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Anyone been to Cape Girardeau? Yeah, it's a beautiful little town, right? 100 miles below St. Louis. We got there. I walked into the registrar's office because, you didn't do anything by computer, right? Early 90s, 91. You didn't do anything by computer. I walked into the registrar's office and I say, hi, I want to register for the program in historic preservation and home restoration. She looks and says, oh, I'm really sorry, but that professor retired and decided not to come back at the end of last semester. I was like, oh, well, I quit my job and moved halfway across the country. That's kind of a shock. And she said, but you know what? We also have this program in museum studies. I thought, well, I'll do that. That's really what I wanted to do in the first place anyway. So I came out, told my fiance, I'm going to do museum studies. And she said, I thought we were going to do house restoration. I'm like, no, we're not going to do that anymore. So I got that degree. Didn't have much to do on it because, of course, I already had a degree in horology and I had a degree in social services. And I needed to do a summer internship, and I called back up to my old museum, the place I had worked when I was 14 years old, the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, formerly the Grand Army of the Republic Hall in the state capitol. Had gotten a grant from the state of Wisconsin. They had built a new building, and now we're to that slide, right on the Capitol Square. I called my old boss. I said, hey, I really need a summer internship. I'm doing this museum studies program. Do you have something for me? And he said, no, I need you to come up and work. He said, I don't need you to intern. I need you to come up and work because you know our collection. You know the State Historical Society's collection. We're trying to open this museum, and yes, come on up. This will be a great thing. We'll bring you in here. And so we went up to Madison, and I became the curator there. But I was a part-time curator because they didn't have a full-time slot. But as you can see, has anyone ever been there? Has anyone been to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison? 1, 2, 3. It's a pretty nice place, all right? It's a pretty nice museum, but it covers Wisconsin's military history, all right? So that's what I was exposed to, was the entirety of Wisconsin military history. So from before the Civil War on up to the current conflict, every branch of service, that's what we were responsible for. Right? So it's not only that, it's World War II, it's World War I, it's Vietnam, it's everything. And it was a great time to work with veterans because you can see they were really cheap. You could get a World War II veteran for half price usually on the weekends. And most veterans, other veterans, were 25% off. So it was always a really good deal. And we could bring them through the doors. It was a wonderful situation. But now I've got to stop just briefly, and I've got to do, well, a little bit of housekeeping because my staff would want me to tell you that everything I'm saying right now is leading into who I am and what we do and how we do it, which is bringing objects into museums. Because that's what I did at the Veterans Museum, and that's what I do here. I specialize in bringing objects into the museum and building the collection. I want to take what we have and reshape it in a way that I believe a collection should be organized. And that's what you are going to see. But what my staff would want you to know is he makes our life really difficult, all right? Because the more material you bring in, the more material you have to process. And the more material you have to process, the more material you have to track. And the more material you have to track, the greater the chances of losing things. Right? So you have to do things like you have to apply numbers to objects. All right? So every single object that exists in a collection has a number applied to it. Do you know that? Every single object has a unique number applied to it. All right? And assigned to it. So you have a collection of things. So if I bring in a collection that has 250 pieces on it, every one of those pieces has to have a number assigned. But then sub-portions of the collection will get smaller numbers assigned to them, right? So, no, let's say this whole room is a collection. What do we have here? 35, 40 people? 47, right? So we have 47 people. So let's say somebody donated the 47 of you to the First Division Museum, right? So we give you a year-based number, right? We'd say, okay, well, it's 2017. And let's say you're the first collection that we bring in 2017, right? So we've got 2017.1. That's your collection number. So you are all part of 2017.1. But then we go to sub-numbers after that. So it's 2017.1 point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How many other numbers you have? But, of course, the problem is you want to maintain associations for objects. Objects always have to maintain their associations. So I'll bet some of you are related, right? Some of you are related. So we've got parents with children, right? So we can't separate the parent from the child, so then we're going to give them a sub-number, right? We're going to give them a 0.1 and a 0.2. So we had 2017.1, 0.1, and 0.2, so that we know that they're associated. And then if we are going to divide that even further and assign numbers to all your clothing, well, how the heck are we going to do that? Are we going to put sub-numbers on all those clothing? No, we're going to put sub-letters on all of your clothing, right? So you might be 27.1, 2A, 2B, unless we had a pair of shoes, and those are A and B, then those have to get a sub-number. See, isn't it good that my staff wants me to provide you that kind of information so you can understand how difficult it is to do their job? And it is difficult to do their job. It's a tremendous challenge. But all these objects, like we say, see a pair of boots? Here's that pair of boots, right? A unique number, 1991.167.4 A and B. Forever tracked like that. A bayonet has the bayonet and the scabbard, A and B. Those get unique numbers assigned to them. Oh, well, this is problematic. Does somebody want to maybe? Yeah, see if you can take a look. That's a bit of a challenge. This is a medical kit, right, that was pulled out of a Viet Cong bunker in 1965 by a guy named Charlie Llewellyn. And you kind of have to wonder yourself, why do people pull things like that out of bunkers? Why do soldiers collect things like that, right? And, well, it's not unique to Americans, but it's close to unique to Americans. And it goes back for quite a while. In fact, Harry Truman wrote about why veterans, or why soldiers, I should say, collect. And he wrote on November 1st, 1918, in a letter to Bess, and he's talking about a German aircraft. He says, one of their aviators fell right behind my battery yesterday and sprained his ankle, busted up the machine, and got completely picked by the French and Americans in the neighborhood. They even tried to take there were two of them in the machine, coats. One of our officers, I'm ashamed to say, took the boots off one with a sprained ankle and kept them. The French and Americans, too, for that matter, are souvenir crazy. If a guard had not been placed on the machine, I don't doubt that it would have been carried away bit by bit. It says, I heard a Frenchman remark that Germany was fighting for territory, England for the sea, France for patriotism, and Americans for souvenirs. So that tells you our soldiers bring material back. Some soldiers bring back more material than others. There's no doubt about it. And the vast majority of veterans, in my experience and exposure, bring back very little or very few pieces. Some veterans, on the other hand, bring back significant amounts of material, large collections. And that particular donor, Charlie Llewellyn, brought back, or donated, I should say, I haven't collected all of it yet, but approximately 100 pieces. All right, 100 different pieces. Now, we're counting that kit you're seeing there as one piece. All right? So you can see all the subcomponents and how that would work, right? So how you would even number and subletter a kit like that. Well, it's a fun challenge, right? You've got sub-numbers and you've got sub-letters. You just have to keep track of them. But an easier way to do it is just to try and maintain the collection as a whole. Place it in a box, try to maintain it as best you can, and then make sure you have solid catalog records. Oh, catalog records, that's another bit of information as a public service announcement from my staff, which is you not only have to apply numbers and letters and assign them to objects, but you also have to make sure all your paperwork's in order. We all know that in life, right? Your paperwork's got to be in order. It has to be. So you have to have your signed deeds of gift that the donor has said, yes, I do give this material to the 1st Division Museum. He has to sign off, and he or she has to sign off and say, yes, 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 we agree that you can have it in perpetuity no matter what. We're never going to come back and ask for it. Well, by the way, they come back and ask for it. But generally, they're not supposed to do that after they signed off on the paperwork. But then we also have to catalog it all. We have to create a record. Now, in the old days, we did it with what? Typewriter and paper, right? That's how we cataloged. That's how we wrote things. It's like creating a library catalog card. We did the same things. But now we have the wonderful computer, which allows us to do all kinds of great things and create catalog records that were much more immense than we ever could have imagined when we did it on a little 4x5 card. But that's okay. It's good to capture information. We like to be able to do that. But the thing is, I told you, you heard me say that came out of a bunker, right? A VC bunker. And that's the thing that I learned about the way that I curate collections. I want to know what an object is. And one of the biggest challenges, which is suggested by what my staff said, is tracking that material, keeping track of it and knowing what it is. It's fine that we can show you this to you right now, and I can tell you that there's a record that documents it. But what happens in 100 years, right? Somebody's got to maintain those databases. It doesn't matter if it's in the cloud or wherever it's going to be 50 years from now. Maybe on Mars. I don't know, but which would, I guess, be above the clouds. You've got to be able to track that information and that history. And I can promise you, I can guarantee you that every curator and every museum professional that came before me thought they were doing the best job possible in tracking materials. They were doing the best thing they could to track materials. Now remember I said I worked at the State Historical Society, Wisconsin Historical Society. I worked there again at same time I was working at the Veterans Museum after I returned. Worked at those two places together. And the Historical Society, the Veterans Museum, had, at that time I joined them, about 10,000 objects in their collection. The State Historical Society had about 500,000 objects in their collection. And I can guarantee you, we did not know where they came from, where all of them came from, or what half of them were. The original, we were using big bound books, much like those big bound newspapers I was dealing with earlier, that were all filled out by hand, beautifully filled out by hand. And they did the same thing. They started assigning numbers, right? And they had a beautiful and easy categorization system. If it was a history object, it got an H, H1, H2, H3. If it was anthropological, it got an A number, A1, A2, A3. And then oddly, if it was numismatic, if it was money, it got an N number. I don't know why they decided to separate money out, but they did. So money had an N1, N2, N3. And that works really well. And you do it in gigantic binders, and you're writing out a description of who the donor is and what the object is. And that really works well until you start to approach really large numbers, and you're writing H 75,325, H 75,326, H, and then they decided that was not a good way to do it. And that's in about the 1940s, all museums said, well, we're going to go with this trinomial system, right? We're going to start doing a year-based number. That will make it much simpler for us. But then they started out with just a two-place number. So they had the year 1, year 2, year 3. Same problem happens when you start getting hundreds, maybe thousands of objects that you're dealing with in a year. So then they go to what we use now, typically, which is a three-place number, because you can't just have that single number. You have to go to the third place out because it's the entire collection. So I was working with all that material, and I became known as the collection whisperer, because I had an innate ability to look at objects and say, I know what this is. I can tell you what this is. And it got to the point where people would come to me and they'd say, hey, Bill, we found something and we don't know what it is. We would like you to help. Sure. Well, I'm here to tell you that I'm not perfect. My children aren't here because they're not yelling. Because I picked this object up. Let's see where it is. Boy, where is this object? This is not my, is this my slide set? All right, I picked this object up. And I'm going to just pass it around because I don't know what the heck this thing is. All right, I was just at a conference and I don't know what this thing is. And if you showed it to me 10 years from now, I don't think I'd know what it is. And I really hope that 50 years from now, well, actually, that's not going to be in a museum 50 years from now. But I hope 50 years from now, there's a curator who's able to look at it and say, I know exactly what that is. But as you see, that's all focused on the objects. Everything we've been talking about is focused on the objects and the importance of the object. But what I learned ultimately is what's really important is the story. All right? There are subject matter experts all over the place. This audience is full of subject matter experts. People who study and understand and know the in and outs of any particular item, just like my aunt knew the in and outs of sandwich glass. Right? Oh my gosh, she knew sandwich glass up, down, and sideways. And there are plenty of experts here. There's plenty of experts that can identify objects, they can identify buttons, they can say, oh, well, this is the second pattern of this, and the third pattern of this is the fourth model made here and there. And you can teach with that information, and you can educate the public with that information, and you can provide a collection that is shown in a museum that people will enjoy seeing. But for me, and because of what we do working with veterans and with the veteran's story, the veteran's story and the story of the object, to me, is what became important to capture. Also, we capture a lot of socks. We'll talk about socks maybe later. But the story is what is important. And so two things happened to me. Number one, the State Historical Society merged their military collections with the State Veterans Museum in Wisconsin. They brought those two, the military components together, and they moved them all over to my new museum, my now permanent job after 2 years at the Veterans Museum. Remember I said it was about 10,000 objects when I got there? We inherited 20,000 objects from the State Historical Society. All right, many objects, we weren't sure where they were from, where they came from. That type of material came in. And so we immediately had to look at it and say, we don't have the space for this. We cannot absorb a collection that's twice the size of our existing collection. It's just not physically possible, nor does it make much sense, because there's got to be redundancies in here, right? There's got to be redundancies. How many socks do you need? Well, that's maybe a lot. Do you need like 100 pairs of socks? Maybe not. There's got to be redundancies. So we had to start looking with a critical eye at the collections and saying, okay, what do we really need to keep? Because if we're going to try and justify maintaining a collection that's greater significantly than the one we already have, there better be a good reason to maintain those objects. Anybody who guesses or can tell me what that little rubber thing is, by the way, will get a free tour of the museum with me, okay? And I'll hang out with you until you're just bored stiff. But you'll have to buy me a beer. So we had to look at those collection pieces and make decisions, and pretty rapid decisions, because the State Historical Society, once they said you can have the military stuff, wasn't going and take your sweet time about it, right? They wanted to get it out of their storage area. So it escalated what we had to do as far as determining what was good for us to keep and maintain within the collection. All right, and that started about 1994. And then in 1995, I met the guy who gave me that watch. He didn't give it to me. He gave it to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. And as you can see, it's in rather rough shape. All right. So this watch belonged to a fellow named Willard Diefenthaler. Willard Diefenthaler served in the 106th Division in World War II. Golden Lines. Does anyone familiar with the Golden Lines? What happened to the 106th Division? All right. 106th Division was in the Battle of the Bulge, captured en masse. It was the largest capture of U.S. soldiers in history. Virtually the entire division was captured at the Battle of the Bulge. They were a brand new division. All right. They were placed in that area because they thought there was going to be low activity. Of course, that's where the Germans attacked. They overran the 106th Division. And I went and visited him in his farm because I got a call, right? And the call said, hey, I've got this generator that is just like the generators that we used in World War II. I'm like, is it a generator you used in World War II? He said, no, it's just like the generators we used in World War II. So, well, okay. That's, I guess, of interest to us, potentially. I said, I'll come up and take a look at it. So we drove up to his farm and took a look. I said, and you're in the 106th Division? He says, yeah. He says, I've got some other stuff from when I was with the division. I said, well, I'd like to see that. Incidentally, we didn't take the generator because it was big, gas-powered, and it wasn't from World War II. But it was just like the one they had in World War II. And he had the plans to document that for me, and it was fascinating. But in a box of materials he said, well, you know, I was a POW of the Germans. I said, oh, okay. And I'm looking through the material, and I see in this box this watch, all right? And obviously, I don't have it here with me, but you can see it's seen better days, right? Half the band, the crystal's gone, the face is deteriorated. It's not a working watch. Not that the fact that it works or doesn't work is important. But I looked at it, and I almost said, oh, I'm not even interested in this watch, right? It's just such poor condition. Because remember who I am, right? I'm a trained watchmaker, so I can look at it. I don't know why we would ever even consider taking this watch into the collection. And I just asked, I said, well, is this the watch you wore in World War II? He says, oh, yeah. Yeah, this is the watch I was wearing when the Germans captured me. I said, oh, well, that's actually interesting. I said, yeah. And I said, it's in tough shape, though. You must have been wearing it. You've worn it since World War II. He said, no. He said, oh, well, what happened was when the Germans captured my unit, and he was in an engineering unit, and why they had generators, they captured us and they lined us all up. Everybody in my company, they lined up. And they started going down the lines of the guys in the company, and they started taking everybody's jewelry. Right? He's taking their wedding rings, they're taking their ID bracelets, and they're taking their watches. And I was in the second half of the line, and when I saw them taking their watches, I took this watch off, and all of us did in the second half of the line. We took our watches off, threw them on the ground, and stomped on them and smashed them. And the Germans saw us do that, and they walked away and didn't take any other jewelry. It said, when they did that, I bent down and I picked up my watch and I stuck it in my pocket. And so it stopped when I was captured. And he was captured, again, Willard with his twin brother, identical twin brother, Wilbur. All right? And so I said, well, man, yeah, we're not going to take the generator, but we really want this watch in the museum collection. Right? This is something that we really want in the museum collection. And it was almost as an afterthought when we were leaving. I said, well, so is Wilbur around? I said, oh, no. Willard died when we were POWs. He said, and the way I found out was the Germans, as the war was getting close to an end, the Germans were moving us from one camp to another, and they'd force march us from one camp to another, and guys would get sick and fall out, and Wilbur was getting sicker and sicker, and he said, oh, you just go on ahead of me. And so I'd go ahead of him, and I'd wait for him at the gate. And he said, and the way I found out that he died was another POW came through the gate and looked at me and said, geez, man, we just buried you about 2 miles back up the road. And so this is what started forming my thinking with regard to our collections, all right, and how we collect, and the nature of what we collect, and why we collect it. We're never going to build a collection exclusively of objects with compelling stories or heart-rending stories. The vast majority of pieces we have a historical background. They have a story, but they don't have that kind of gravity. But that's the type of story that we're always asking for. That's what we're going for. So you can look at a set of gloves like this. All right, these are German gloves, World War II, German mittens, shooting gloves. You got a name for them, Ian? What? Yeah. No, these come from a lot of guys on the ground. That's where we get them from. So they're German gloves. They're unused. I've never seen a pair that was not unused, right? But we're using this pair as an example. They came into our collection without any kind of a history down here. But up in Wisconsin, all right, I was working with a veteran, an artillery veteran, and he had some material laid out. And I was looking at him, and he had a pair of these gloves. I said, well, where did you get those gloves? They don't look used. Got them out of a warehouse. He says, no. He says, I was running along a ditch, and there was a high stone wall. I said, oh, yeah? He said, yeah. And as I was running along, I saw these gloves sitting up on the stone wall. And so I ran up there and I grabbed them. I said, well, couldn't there been a sniper or something waiting for you to grab those gloves? He's like, I don't know, I guess. I didn't think about it. I saw a really nice pair of gloves. And he grabbed them. And I said, well, okay, there's a bit of a story, right? That's pretty interesting. I mean, they're unused. It's like a souvenir item. And there's a little bit of story about how he obtained them. And so we chatted a bit, and I was leaving his house. And we were talking about, he had his decorations framed on the wall. And amongst his decorations was a bronze star with a V device. Now, does everybody, I keep asking you, does everybody know? And I know everybody doesn't know. Some of you do and some of you don't. All right, so Bronze Stars can be awarded for being a really good typist. All right, they're not an automatic valor award. Right? A Bronze Star needs to have a V device on it, a V for valor, applied to the ribbon to determine or to suggest, to tell somebody that it was for a valorous action versus just being really good at your job. All right, so I saw he had that with the V device. And I said, oh, you got a Bronze Star with a V device? He says, yeah, I did. He says, you can't have that. I said, well, that's okay. I said, but, he said, how about if I give you a copy of the citation? I said, sure, we'd love to have a copy of the citation. So he prints it out for me, and I'm reading it, and it says, Corporal Meredith C. Thompson, Field Artillery, Army of the United States, distinguished himself by heroic achievement in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. While serving with Battery B, 563rd Field Artillery Battalion on 7 April 1945 in vicinity of Fraunrode, Germany. When radio communication between his forward observer party and the battalion post failed, Corporal Thompson, with utter disregard for his personal safety, voluntarily proceeded 400 yards down an open road which was swept by heavy enemy small arms and automatic weapons fire, returning with another radio. And I read that and I said, so you got the Bronze Star when you were running down the road like 400 yards? He says, yeah. Hold these, right? So I said, hold them. And I said, is that when you got those gloves? Is that when you got those gloves? So like you're running down the road, oh, gloves. Is that when you got these gloves? He said, yeah, that's when I got them. So you can put him down. So we need to always ask these stories. We need to pursue the stories and try to find them as best we can. Okay, so I got 5 minutes. Man, we got like an hour and a half to go. No. So what I did was, at that time, I decided, you know, we need to set a very simple set of rules that can be paired with our collections policy, with our museum mission statement, a simple set of rules that's going to allow us to look at any particular object or set of objects. And it's not going to be a magic wand, but it's got to be something that allows us to use our brains simply and determine the validity of material, the value of adding particular pieces to the collection. All right? And so we've got 4 simple rules. I have 4 rules. I'm willing to share these with everybody right now for a low, low price of free. All right? So those 4 rules are, number 1, do we have an example of an object in the collection? That's the first thing we do. If I'm looking at an object or a collection of objects, I'm looking at Charlie Llewellyn's 100 pieces, do we have one? Do we have 10? Do we have any? That's always the first question we ask. So if we do have one, that's a determining factor for us. Number 2, is it a rare or unusual item? Okay, maybe we have one, maybe we don't. But it's a highly unusual or unique piece. So even if we do have one, adding another one's not going to be a big burden on our collection because it's such an unusual piece. Number 3, we want to look at the condition of an object. Because if an object is in very poor condition, what do we have to do to maintain it? Now, I can tell you on that we don't do anything to maintain it. We didn't have to do anything to maintain it. But some objects require a great deal of care. They require care by a professional conservator, and that can cost thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to maintain and stabilize an object. So we always need to think about that. We need to think about that care. But then most importantly, what we talk about, what we think about is the history of use of the object. Right? Not every object is going to have the story of grabbing the gloves off the wall while you're earning a Bronze Star with a V device. Not every watch is going to be smashed to prevent the Germans from taking it from you. But the history, you want to have a bigger history for any object or collection of objects. And that ties back into our mission statement. So for us here at the 1st Division Museum, first and foremost, if you're not a 1st Division veteran, we're probably not going to consider the objects that you have. And that's been a problem. The museum, when it started in 1960, really served as more of a military museum for the western suburbs. So when I came here, we had Navy material and Army Air Corps material and Marine Corps material, and it all took up space, and the chances are that we are never going to exhibit because it wasn't related to the 1st Division, right? So we had to look at that and say, well, this is not really 1st Division material, and it's taking up valuable storage space for us. We need to find better homes for that material so that we can bring in more 1st Division related materials, right? That's what was important for us. Another thing that we look at, and this is broader, is rotation of objects, because you don't want to put anything out permanently, all right? Items do deteriorate, and people come, I bet all of you have been to our museum at least once, right? Maybe twice, maybe 10 times. Hopefully you're going to see something new when you go there. You don't want to see the same thing year after year after year. So we want to maintain a collection that's going to be able to allow us to provide things for people to look at, unusual pieces and unique pieces. And are there things that we're always going to accept? That's a question. Is there something that you're always going to look at and say, yes, we will take that no matter what? And that, of course, is something like a Medal of Honor. Right? A Medal of Honor from a 1st Infantry Division veteran is something that we are always going to take in the collection. Doesn't matter how many we have. And right now we have 7 Medals of Honor, and we have, this is the Ross McGinnis Medal, and so that's the most recent piece that we got into the collection, and that's the only one we have. It's the only 1st Division Medal of Honor for the current conflict. So we will maintain that, but we have 2 from Vietnam, 2 from World War II, and 2 from World War I. So we are able to rotate those. So we would bring in more Medals of Honor. So these few pieces I have on the table here, we do bring in new material, all right? And sometimes we buy material. Pick it up, man. Like this, all right? This is, Ian's a strong young man, he can do this. This is a set of World War I German body armor, all right? This is something that we don't have in the collection, and it was brought home along with this German helmet by a 1st Division veteran. Now, we don't have the great details for those pieces, which is often the case. Sometimes you'll find content in letter collections from veterans, sometimes not. But in this case, the veteran had scratched 1st Division and his name, which we could trace on the back of the helmet, and it came with this body armor. What's that weigh in? 35 pounds? 40 pounds? 35, 40. Right? So the Germans that carried these machine guns, everybody has been to the museum since we reopened, right? And studied every single exhibit, right? No? Oh, well, we got something to do tomorrow then, right? Tomorrow, right? So in the World War I case, we have that MGO 815 on display. That's you can carry that. It's heavy. But, of course, machine gunners in World War I on either side drew significant amounts of fire. You know, it's interesting, you go back to something like the Medal of Honor. Through different conflicts, Medals of Honor, the highest decorations were often awarded for different reasons. So when they started the Medal of Honor in the Civil War, they were most typically awarded for capturing enemy flags, right? So capturing a Confederate flag was going to get you a Medal of Honor. In World War I, machine guns were obviously the terror of the battlefield, right? And so many of the higher decorations, Distinguished Service Crosses, Navy Crosses for the Marines, and Medals of Honor are associated with the capturing of or the defending of machine gun positions, right? So machine guns were, the machine gunners were a target. They were somebody that everybody wanted to kill. And so the Germans came up with that set of body armor to give some protection to their machine gunners. Right? Now, I don't know how mobile you would have really been with that. You were pretty much stuck. Most of the machine guns, this is set up, like I said, as a portable machine gun. Many machine guns were in fixed positions. So the idea was to develop something like that to protect the men. And there you can see, there's a 1st Division veteran who's posing with a set of German machine gun armor on and a German helmet. Right? Remember what Harry Truman said, right? Americans fight for souvenirs. Well, that guy did anyway. Presumably brought home. Wouldn't it be cool if that was the set he brought home? We're not that lucky. We're not able to say that that is the case. This patch, has everybody seen this patch? God, okay. Not everybody has seen this patch. So this is a 1st Division patch as worn by an artilleryman in World War I. But this is also 1st Division patch that circled the moon. Michael Collins' father was an artilleryman with the 1st Division. Right? And you're allowed to take a small number of personal items with you on a moon mission. And one of the pieces that Michael Collins took with him was that moon patch. So when Michael Collins took that photo, he had that 1st Division patch in his suit pocket. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. But it's just like every other 1st Division patch unless you have a number and a story assigned to it, right? Who knows? And I didn't include the photo of the envelope that he mailed it to us in, but it's a funny little envelope. But it's a unique story and it's a unique piece. We have many 1st Division patches. We only have one 1st Division patch that circled the moon. Now, some objects are in the collection. As I said, I can't account for the material that came to the collection before I joined the museum. Wow, does that sound like a dodge or what? I'm not responsible for the material that you see here. Many pieces came into the collection, and the attentiveness or the ability of the staff to determine what they are, or what their history is somewhat limited. But sometimes some of those pieces that come in are unique enough, and even without a veteran story, we know they're historic pieces. We can tell. This helmet, this World War II helmet, was donated by the 16th Infantry Regiment Association, so the veterans of the 16th Infantry Regiment. It's an incredible World War II helmet, and of the material that we're talking about, of the unique pieces, and those pieces that have associated stories, it's the combat pieces that are the most unique and have the most rarity. Because in a situation when you're in combat, you're not generally thinking of maintaining things, right? You're not thinking of grabbing German gloves off of a stone wall and saving them. That's not something that's in your mindset. So objects that survive from combat are the rarest pieces to have, and that they have that associated story with them of use in combat. I cannot tell you 100% that helmet that Laura is carrying around was used in combat, but I can tell you with about 98% certainty because of the netting that's on it, the 1st Division insignia and captain's bars that are painted on the front of the helmet, the single bar that's painted on the back of the helmet. Can everyone see that? See that there's that white bar right in there? Right? And so that designated any soldier following this officer that was an officer wearing it. A vertical bar in the back of the helmet indicated an officer. A horizontal bar indicated a non-commissioned officer or a sergeant. Right? And so men following on could tell that. So this, in all likelihood, is a combat helmet. I say I am completely comfortable saying it's a combat helmet worn by a 16th Infantry Regiment officer in World War II. That's not something we're going to get rid of. It doesn't violate any of our rules, but it's not, and at the same time, somebody could look at that set of rules and go, well, you don't really know the history. Well, in that particular case, it's close enough. These boots are not here. You will have to go to the museum to see them. I'm sorry, yeah, I know. But these boots are unique. And can you tell they're bronzed, right? Everybody knows like baby shoes, right? Remember do they still do that? Do they still bronze baby shoes? Is it a thing, right? So we got this as part of a collection. Now, again, the veteran had passed, but this is another POW story. This is our POW story. And this fellow, Sansone, was captured in 1944 and held by the Germans until the end of the war. And these are the boots he was wearing when he was captured. He continued to wear as a POW, used when he was liberated, and brought home, and was so happy to have those boots that he bronzed them. Can you get in there? Thank you, man. He bronzed them. And so they came in as part of a collection. Again, the veteran had passed, but we had the complete story. We had the newspaper article from the 1960s where he's posing with his boots and saying, these are the boots I wore. So it's a complete story, but this is one of those problems. Remember, so we've got those different things we look at, right? Do we have one in the collection? Is it rare? What's the condition? All right, well, you could think that a bronze set of boots is stable, but that is really not the best way to guarantee the long-term preservation of a leather object. And so we decided to get in touch and involve a conservator, and the conservator removed the bronze finish from the boots. Right? Because it's just a paint, it's not actual bronze. Right? If anyone had sold you baby shoes and told them it was real bronze, it's not. Right? It's just paint. So you can see those. They're in our Aachen Battle of the Bulge exhibit right now, and they look like just a pair of boots. But they are just a pair of boots that a soldier was wearing when he was captured. That's a highly unusual item, a truly unique piece. This is a piece that we do not yet have, but I am picking it up tomorrow. Okay, that's a D-Day assault vest. All right. Now, you've seen the objects that we have on display on Omaha Beach. Right? There's very few pieces there. There's the helmets, the two helmets, the 6th Beach Battalion helmet paired with the 1st Division helmet. I think there's a duffel bag out right now. There's a wallet and a crucifix in the waterproof pouch. Very few objects are there. Very few pieces survived the D-Day, the actual landing, because material gets worn out. And people aren't thinking, oh, you know, here I am fighting through the hedgerows, I better start to save this stuff. One of the things they developed specifically for the Normandy invasion were these assault vests. It was meant to go over your regular uniform. It carried extra gear. You could carry extra grenades, extra clips of ammunition. It had an integrated backpack on it. And like I said, it just went over your regular uniform. Problem was they couldn't get them produced fast enough. They got them produced pretty fast, and they got them out to the assaulting companies on Omaha Beach and also some of the assaulting companies in the 4th Division. So I think about 4,000 to 5,000 went out to each beach area. And then there were more that were produced after the fact, but they decided after the invasion it was not the best way to go. It wasn't practical. It didn't really supplement or benefit the soldiers beyond their regular load of ammunition and equipment. It's cumbersome. It was awkward. It didn't really serve the purpose of the invasion, and so they never used them again. There are an extremely small number. I think maybe there might be 2 existing that they know of that came from the landing area, and they were found in France, but of course they're not identified with units. So there's a handful of them that exist that were surplused out, and this is one of those surplus pieces. And we obtained it at auction just last week. And so, again, we do not have that story of use by the 1st Division. But if you look at, do you have one in the collection? No. Is it rare? Yes. This one's in good condition. It is missing the story, but it does have the story of its development, which was pretty narrow, well, extremely narrow to the D-Day landings. And so this is a type of piece that we thought, okay, this is worth an investment for the museum to go out and get. So stay tuned. And sometimes we have pieces that just don't warrant being in the collection, such as this Vietnam boonie hat. It's nothing wrong with it. It is a hat from Vietnam, but again, this also was a purchase piece for the museum, but it has no history with it. And the fact of the matter is that we still have a significant number of Vietnam veterans left, significant number of Vietnam veterans from the division, and so we shouldn't have to purchase material from the Vietnam War. We should be able to obtain it from our veterans of the division, and whoever wins that free tour can see many Vietnam boonie hats that are part of our collection that are identified to 1st Division veterans. Some of the objects that come back, as I told you earlier, Charlie Llewellyn brought back 100 pieces with him. And Charlie, if he could have been a museum curator, which he would deny wholeheartedly, he would have made a great museum curator because the materials that he brought back are rare and unusual, including this flashlight. You can see, again, these are almost all the pieces he brought back are jungle-made items. This is a flashlight assembled to resemble an American L-shaped flashlight, a common American field flashlight, but as you can see, it's got 2 D-cell batteries that are held together with bamboo splints that are then wrapped in rubber and have wire run up to that, well, now smashed head and an electrical switch added in. It's the craziest get-up ever, but it speaks to the ingenuity of the Viet Cong and what they were constructing and manufacturing in their jungle workshops. This is another piece that Charlie Llewellyn brought back. You want to carry that around? Yeah, say a hand for Ian, man. He's carrying all the heavy stuff around. Everyone. Yeah, it is like. So you can see this is a bear trap. Essentially, does everybody? Bear trap we got. Well, this is a man trap. It's jungle made. It's blacksmith made. And they pulled it out of a booby trap that was set up along a trail. And again, this is where we have a story, a very specific story from Charlie, where they were walking along the trail, and his point man noticed some leaves, a pile of leaves along the trail, and thought it looked odd, and they called him up. They moved the leaves away, and they found that trap set in it. And that had a sub-booby trap attached to it. They blew that secondary booby trap and then proceeded to carry that piece out of the jungle with them. And the trip plate on it, right there, that flat metal trip plate is made out of an American artillery shell canister. And it's got the stenciling. Ian, flip it upside down for everybody. Yeah, right. It's got the remnants of the stenciling on the bottom side. Again, we could not possibly hope for a veteran to be able to think about this type of material and bring it to us. But they do. And we have to be able to ask the right questions to get these people to bring the material forward and tell us about it. Now this is a helmet, and it's the perfect example of how this works. And to get the veterans to bring the material, I am continually preaching to them. I am talking to them and telling them what it is we want, what we need to bring into the museum, why we need to bring it into the museum, over and over again. And some guys just don't get it. And it's really hard because they'll say, I got my dress uniform. We really don't want dress uniforms. We've got plenty of those. What we're looking for are these. And so I use the stories, like I've been telling you, to introduce to the veteran the idea of what we want. And every once in a while, someone will really get it. Like the guy that gave us this helmet, and he served with the 1st Division in '69. I don't know if we want to show the you can choose. This has some language on it reflecting the particular 1st Division veteran's opinion of the war. But he's a guy that I was giving a talk to his entire group, and he said, I know exactly what you want, and I will send it to you. Well, that's never a really good thing, and I try to say, well, what is it? He says, I'll send it to you. I know exactly what you want. And a couple of weeks later, this helmet showed up in the box, right? And he's right. This is exactly what we want. And he provided with it. You see those numbers on it? You're looking at it. It's a short timer's calendar on it. Right? See, there's a set of numbers right there by the exclamation point, right? So he's counting down his time in Vietnam. But again, these are combat-used, combat-worn items that we're obtaining from veterans. This is the type of material we want. It makes up a very small percentage of the materials that are out there and available to us. Now I'm going to tell one story, and this is a cautionary note from my standpoint, because sometimes you can get too cocky as a curator. All right, I know that's a nice alliteration. But sometimes it's possible to say, well, I know exactly what we want, and I'm really good at talking to my veterans, and I know how to bring the material in. JD's telling me I got 10 minutes left. But sometimes you have to, well, not sometimes, you always have to remember to ask the right questions of the veterans. And I got a call, and this is jumping back to Madison, from a veteran who said, well, I've got my dog tags. I was a Vietnam veteran, and I said, oh, dog tags, we don't really need dog tags. What are dog tags? But his name was George Banda, and I knew he was a member of the Latino American Veterans Association. And I said, well, you know, we don't have a lot of material from Latino veterans. And so I think I might take these dog tags just because. They're not big. And so George brought these dog tags down. He was a medic. And I looked at the dog tags, and this is like the Diefenthaler story. I looked at it, and I said, well, there's only one tag. Did you have the other one in your bootlace? He says, no, I used to wear them both around my neck. But one time we were loading a guy in a chopper, and he wasn't going to make it, and he grabbed a hold of my other dog tag that was on a secondary loop, and he yanked it off, and I just let him go with it. So then I only had one dog tag. And I was looking at that cover, that soft cover that's on the dog tag there, and you know, you can see it's got some brown staining in there. And I said, well, George, you know, you wore this in the field, it's dirty. And he said, well, that's not just dirt, that's also blood, right? Because the guys I work on, I lay on when I'm working on them, and so blood would seep into the dog tag cover, right? So if I look at that and I say, well, it's another dog tag, then George keeps his dog tag, and that story isn't preserved. That's what we want. So we always need to ask our questions. Everyone seen this poster, right, at the entrance to the museum in the new Duty First Gallery? That predates the division, but that is one really rare and unusual poster. Again, this is something we obtained. No one donated it. We had to go out and locate it, find it. But that is probably the only existing poster, recruiting poster, from the 5th U.S. Artillery from the Civil War. In fact, I would be willing to bet that that is the only recruiting poster from the 5th U.S. Artillery. So that is an extremely rare and unusual piece, and it ties directly to our division's lineage. Our new guys, these are the folks that we're working hardest on. Joe Naylor, his story is in Duty First right now. And by the way, Joe Naylor was originally one of my veterans in Wisconsin, and he didn't want to give up his stuff. So when I got down here, I said, hey, Joe, I'm at the 1st Division Museum now. How about it? And he came forward, and he donated the material, and they don't like me in Madison anymore. But one thing we can do, and you know, it's one thing for me to stand here and tell you a story. It's another thing for us to put a text out that tells you the story. It's another thing to have that panel, and that's what we're doing with those soldier story panels. You can push those buttons and you can hear stories from these individuals, and that's Joe, and that was Joe's stuff. Now, Joe's unit came here in August, and we talked to the guys, we gave them the pitch, and one of their guys just started messaging me from Nebraska, and he was wounded in an IED attack. And literally last week, he sent me photos, and he said, well, here's my truck after it was flipped in the IED attack. Here I am after getting picked up, and you see the blood here, right? He still has that coat. And he says, does the museum want that coat? Does the museum want that coat? Yeah, the museum wants that coat. The museum wants that story. I think we're at an end. I wish I could keep going, but I can't. I think we're going to wrap it there. So, does anybody have any questions?
What do you do with all the stuff that gets sent to us here and that you don't use? Where does it go?
Now, we try not to have materials sent here that we don't want. The vast majority of people do reach out to us ahead of time, and what we say is, all right, tell us who it's from, give us the story, and then send us an inventory. And it kind of puts the onus on them to provide us that information, and then we're able to look at the list, peruse it, and make a determination. But if people just send us material unsolicited, then we have a situation where we have to make a decision. And sometimes it's great material. Sometimes we're fine with that. We reach back out to the potential donor and we say, well, we need a story. And if they're forthcoming and it's good information, that's great. But if the material, it's like I said before, if it isn't related to the First Division, and that does happen, then we don't keep it. What we'll do is just, in that case, we'll just return it to them. We'll mail it back to them. So, and you know, can I go here first? Yeah.
Have you ever considered going into military and bringing back things from?
No.
Okay.
These guys are a lot braver than I am.
Okay, that's a good question.
And I'm too old now. But they're a lot braver than I am.
Yeah, on that World War II helmet that had the webbing,
yeah.
Along in that picture on the side were some different colors. Is there some significance to those different colors? Were they either the rank of the individual or something else?
On the one, the netted?
No, I mean on the slide up there. You had a group of colors like blue, white, red, something else.
No,
I just wonder what.
I'm sorry, that's the color registration for the photo. They just use that as a color registration on setting up the photo. Great question. I had no idea what you're talking about, but now I do.
Hey, Bill. Great presentation tonight. Thanks to your team, so far unnamed, but I'm sure you'll introduce them later.
Yeah,
two things.
right.
How do you put a value on a contribution, an appraisal, or if we have something in our own collection that is valuable, how do you suggest we get it appraised? And number two, have you ever gotten anything that went boom?
Good question. Well, first off, we are not allowed to appraise items. All right, the museum, because of the nature of our arrangement that we have, if we get involved with assigning values to objects, then that creates a conflict of interest. Because I could assign a greater value to something that you had that I might really want to bring into the collection, right? I could say, oh, well, that set of German mittens is really awesome. We'll give you an appraised value of $5,000 and you can use that on your taxes. So we can't do that. We're not allowed to assign any values. We're not even allowed to help people with assigning values to objects. If somebody comes to us and says, I'm going to put a value of $10,000 on my donation, that's fine. You're welcome to do that, but we can't verify that value for you. The only way that you're able to actually obtain a true appraised valuation is through a professional appraiser. That's what we have to do. And we have a list of folks that we can direct people to that will, for a fee, of course, conduct a formal appraisal, and they'll produce a document, a legal document that is then something that you can use with regard to your taxes. And that's typically the way that goes down. Now the other question is, have we ever had anything that's explosive come in? Not on my watch and not to my knowledge. Most of the explosive pieces that were brought back, they must have worked their way through DOD guys, or ordnance folks, because I've never seen, in 25 years, I've never seen a live piece of ordnance come through any of the museums I've worked with. Now that doesn't apply to Civil War shells. Many Civil War cannonballs, explosive Civil War shells are alive. So there.
All right, I have one more over here when you're ready.
Okay.
Hi. How do you describe the rephrase? Is that cataloging system that I think said trinomic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that universal among all the museums?
I wish it was. It's pretty close to universal, though. Yeah, it's pretty close. Many museums do use that system. The vast majority of museums use that system, that trinomial system. But it doesn't cross over from one museum to the next, so it's not like a nationwide, right? It's still individual to your institution. So, yeah, there's duplicate numbers in every single museum because we all use the same set of year-based numbering.
And my other is, are you as a museum curator under an obligation to share, or can you just set your rules? How does that work?
As far as
Share the museums, like would any of this, for instance, like the King Tut
right.
exhibit travel at
sure.
one point, but anything like
Yes.
what are the kind of the basic rules and regulations on that?
Yeah, museums are all different. Every museum has a different set of rules that dictates how they handle it, and so that's a loan. So we borrow items sometimes from time to time if we want a particular object for an exhibit, and this was especially true when we were doing the traveling or the temporary exhibits prior to our permanent galleries. We would borrow objects from other institutions if we didn't have an example in our collection. Similarly, we will loan items out. And typically the way that works is you'll have a request from another institution, either a written request or an email request now. It says, hi, we're looking for X, and we're able to look at your collection catalog online and saw that you have an example of X. Would you be willing to loan it to us? Then they have to submit a set of documents that shows that they're a valid institution, that they're going to be able to provide the correct humidity and temperature controls, the right lighting, and the right security for the object. So, we wouldn't give it to someone to use in their home, but another professional institution that's able to provide the proper documentation, we'd certainly loan objects out. Yeah. All right, everybody else that's here, Laura Sears, the folks that worked with me, Jackie, our new guy, Ian. Is that fair? The new guy? And Nick, who does all of our AV activities every time and does a terrific job. Thanks to everybody for coming, and come back next week for part 2. No, that's about it. Thanks.